Hey everyone, it's Andrew Schiffman.
Harry Turcott here. We both worked at MTV in the music and talent department in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, it was a time where music videos, TRL, The Jersey Shore, and the Osbournes ruled the airwaves.
Yes, Andrew, those are some great years. So tune in every week as we catch up with old MTV coworkers, record label execs, VJs, and artists.
I can't wait, Perry. We'll give you insights into meeting superstars before they were superstars and some juicy secrets from that golden age of MTV.
So grab your headphones and get ready to relive the era of music television and the people who shaped a generation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're back. Welcome to the Music Lounge. This is going to air in a few weeks, but tonight is fight night. I'm very excited about Tyson and Jake Paul. But aside from that, very excited. We're about 4 months into this podcast. We've been reconnecting with some great people, maybe some people I've brought in that Perry wasn't too familiar with. And this is one that Perry's connecting with, a name that I've heard throughout my whole career, but really this is the first time I've got to have a chat with. So Perry, do the intro.
Well, this person is completely responsible for me having a career at MTV.
I've heard
If
that
it hadn't,
before, Perry. This is, I'm kidding.
if it hadn't been for him, I would not have ended up at MTV. I was brought in for a 3-month gig to cover someone's maternity leave, and that person did not come back, and I ended up staying for almost 10 years. So I have this person to thank for that. Today we have Brandon Schmidt, who is currently the Director of Product Management at Invenium. He is formerly the Director of Music Programming for MTV and MTV.com, and also has his own artist management company, B23 Management. Welcome, Brandon.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. I don't know if I've ever actually had the chance to say to you, thank you for my career at MTV.
Well, I'm super excited to hear that, Perry, and I don't know that I can take full credit, but it's certainly you took the ball and you ran with it for sure. And it's funny, I didn't even remember that you came in to cover for Joanne. She lives about a half a mile from me.
Really?
Now, and so I see her on social media more than in person, but it is kind of funny how things end up like that.
Wow.
And her kid that was on maternity leave is probably in college right now as well, which is even scarier.
Yeah, absolutely. Or probably even out of college at this point.
Yeah.
Yes, the time goes by quickly. When I started, Brandon and I shared what was probably a closet. I don't even know if it was an office space because it was long and narrow, and we had 2 desks in there, and it was a little cramped, but somehow we were able to get all of our work done, and it was a crazy time. So
that office was like everybody who lives in New York's first New York apartment, right? Like
right.
Railroad style, tiny. You make it work, and somehow you can't figure out how you get all the people and all the stuff in there, but somehow it just works.
And I do remember that we always knew what time it was because we could hear a roar of a crowd outside when TRL started on the 29th floor, which was crazy.
Yeah, that was a little bit later for sure, but yeah, some crazy times.
So starting at MTV and your journey there, you were doing artist relations and programming for what was originally called MTV Online and MTV Radio. And then you moved to MTVI, which was going to be MTV's digital spinoff. And then you came back to what we call the mothership of MTV and finally ended up in the MTV music and programming and talent department. Can you sort of take us through that whole experience about how you got there and all the different iterations of the companies you worked for, and how your job was basically the same thing but in all these different places.
Yeah, I will do my best. It's been a minute, and I'll try and remember as many names and people along the way as I can. So I kind of like you, Perry. I got hired at MTV as a temp position. I have my best friend and roommate from college, Dave Anderson, to thank for it. Dave was the Choose or Lose bus manager in 1996, and the person who had been the kind of marketing department liaison to the bus was leaving the position, and they needed somebody to come in and replace him for until the election. And so for 6 months, I came in and worked out of the MTV marketing department, being the point of contact for anybody externally trying to reach the bus as it toured around the country, and anybody at MTV who was trying to coordinate things with the bus. I was the kind of intermediary between that.
Couldn't they just text the person? No.
So obviously that job came to a close in November, and I was still living in Philadelphia, and I had been commuting back and forth weekly to New York, and I knew that I wanted to stay. My goal had always been to work in the music industry, having been a musician and worked in record stores and DJ'd and played in bands and all those things previously. I wanted to work behind the scenes in the industry, and I wanted to be in New York, and this was my closest shot to doing that. Little did I know at the time that MTV really wasn't the music business. MTV was in the television and ad sales business. And as one person said to me at one point, MTV, for the number of people at MTV who have anything to do with music, we could be the Gulf Network. So as my time was drawing to a close, I went to David Cohn, who was the VP of the marketing department, and somebody who mentored me in a lot of ways through my time at MTV, whether he knew it or not. And I expressed to him my interest in trying to find something a bit more permanent. And he told me that there was a kind of nascent department, MTV Online, and they were launching something called MTV Local, which was
Right. I remember that.
between programming between MTV, MTV2, which at that time was still M2, and MTV.com. And having been somebody who had been hugely involved in a local music scene in Philadelphia, playing in a band, managing a record store, doing all these things, seemed like a natural fit. So I interviewed there with Rick Holtzman, who was the head of MTV.com at the time. I remember going into the interview. I don't think I'd ever actually been online. I learned what HTML stood for, thinking that in case somebody asked me, I could kind of play it off that I knew what I was talking about. But that didn't really have any bearing. What I was being brought in for, I had experience with. And so I joined a team of 4 people that were kind of responsible for providing all of this programming that would be pushed out as the national feed went out to all these markets, there would be like 8 minutes per hour that was a local feed. And that's where you get like your localized advertising and whatnot. And in each of the top 75 media markets in the country, we provided localized content around radio, like radios. We had radio partners, we had independent newspaper partners, we had like on the ground intern journalists, and then we kind of sourced content from each of these partners. And my role was to bring on the radio station and the newspaper partners and to bring in content. What were the top 10 ads at the station? What were the top selling records at a record store? Concert previews, concert reviews, things like that. From there, there were changes going on within MTV.com. The department was growing from, I think there was maybe 10 people when I joined, and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. I mean, MTV at that time, their website was like mtv.aol.com, and there were definitely changes going on. It was going from being more of a kind of online magazine to being more of like what we think of now as like a web experience. And at the time, there were Marcia Zellers was running the music department within MTV.com, and she was leaving, and I made a play for replacing her and was given the opportunity to do that and to kind of try and create what music at MTV.com would be moving forward. And I worked very closely with Joanne Hankey, Perry, who you replaced, John Bartleson, and we worked with the MTV Radio Network team, and we brought in artists, we did interviews, we brought people in to do radio stuff. And we had a bunch of freelance journalists around the country who were writing record reviews. But at this time, it was really where we were starting to dip our toe in the water of premiering videos and doing listening parties. And what could we be doing that matched what MTV did, but also MTV was constrained by, a programming grid. They had 24 hours. We didn't have any constraints. Right? It was the Wild West. As long as we were covering what MTV needed us to cover, we could cover whatever else we wanted, as long as we had the passion, the people, and the time to do it.
In those early days, how did you measure the success? Obviously, you could see and probably measure traffic, but you had nothing to compare it to, and you can't compare it to broadcast, right?
That is an absolutely fantastic question. And I actually reference to this day what we used as our analytics back then, because nowadays people are so bombarded with data. You have access to everything, right?
Yeah.
Google Analytics, you just have an ability to access data. Whether or not you understand how to read it is a different question. Now, this was probably, a couple years into this process. We had weekly meetings with a department within MTV, and I can't remember what they were called, but they were basically the information and research team, and they were collecting data. So they were collecting viewership data, but they were also collecting web data for us. And what we saw on a weekly basis was page views, time spent on site, where somebody came to the site from, and where they went to after they left. That was it. And we did a lot based on that information. I remember a whole directive coming down that, the ad sales department really liked when they could show advertising partners that something had gotten a lot of clicks. Also, what got a lot of clicks? Photos, right? If you did a photo book as part of a website and you made people click through 45 photos, that was 45 page views. And if you had an advertiser on each of those 45 pages, all of a sudden ad sales had a lot more to sell against. So the directive came down, photo books on everything.
Yeah.
And I remember, Perry and I were probably told okay, when we bring artists in, now we're doing photo shoots. Right. So we have
the other thing that they actually at one point said, don't promote music videos because we can't afford the cost of all the streaming of it. It was interesting.
Some of that early period saw some just amazing stuff happening in those halls. I remember when John Bartleson, who did programming for MTV.com, really was an expert in hip hop and R&B, and John Gill, who was at the MTV Radio Network, similarly, his beat was the hip hop R&B side. And I remember when they brought in Eminem, long before anybody really knew who Eminem was, and this was based, purely on him being a known entity in kind of the rap battle world, and we brought Eminem in to do an exclusive set of freestyles with DJ Stretch Armstrong, and recorded it in the conference room on, I guess, I don't even know what floor we were on at that point, 29, I think. And here comes Eminem in with one guy, Stretch Armstrong, and we set up a bunch of turntables and a mixer and just recorded the whole thing. I was now being invited into meetings with the MTV programming team and the head of MTV News and various leaders of departments when labels would come in, the head of marketing, the head of video promo, sometimes label presidents or GMs would come in and present a project to the MTV team. And I remember this was one of the few instances where they came in to present Kid A, and the label folks were far less interested in what was the channel going to do for them than they were what was MTV.com going to do for them, because they really knew that that's where the Radiohead audience was congregating, and that they knew what the number of spins they might get on a video would amount to, but the lasting impressions of what was going on online. So yeah, we took all those Stanley Dunwood blips and the googly minotaur and all of that visual content that they were creating, and we had a field day with it. I remember pretty much daily phone calls with Jen Bird and Robin Bechtel and the folks there, and they were just so forward thinking at the time with what they were doing, kind of with their online partners.
I mean, they knew the power of the MTV brand. They knew that people were going to MTV probably at that point for a lot of news and discovery and features. So to have a full takeover on this platform was just massive.
Absolutely. Because if you didn't catch the video when it aired, or if the video aired at 2 a.m. or whatever, it happened and it was gone. It was this fleeting thing. But if you had space on the MTV.com homepage for a week or 2 weeks or however long it was, and that was always part of what we would
page placement was massive.
work into our leverage for getting these opportunities and having people bring this to us.
Well, the great thing about that too is you said it earlier, it's sort of like the Wild West. MTV.com could sort of do whatever it wanted to do. If there was a cool idea that was doable, we kind of did it, and it wasn't always tied to an extension of what the channel was doing with something. If we're able to create our own original content that was just unique to us.
Yeah, and that was what was interesting, Perry, was not only were we tasked with all of the label, client, artist relations work, booking all those interviews, bringing people in, overseeing their visits, coordinating between online and radio and the different needs. We were also responsible for all of that original programming content that was living on MTV.com. And yeah, when we had the idea to do, okay, so fantasy baseball is a big thing at the time, let's do a fantasy record label. And we created a game that was purely based on TRL voting, the number of spins of a video, sales. We were pulling data from various points. How many views the artist A to Z page got, how many streams the video got, all these different things. And you could buy and sell artists, and you had a budget to sign them to your fantasy record label. We did, for the Video Music Awards one year, when we did the Webios, right, where we created unique videos in kind of Flash programming, where we partnered a video director, a Flash designer, and the artist to create these unique interactive video experiences. And we worked with the one that I most vividly remember was with Bjork, because you would, as the video played, if you moused over and clicked on things, like things were happening on the screen, so that it changed. The video was different every time you watched it based on the user. We worked with the Beastie Boys and Tamara Davis and all these great MTV artists and directors.
I remember going to Moby's apartment to actually meet with him to talk about it. Yeah, which was super cool. Yeah.
All of a sudden, like Web 1.0 was starting to gain all this traction, and there were all these startups that were becoming valued at 100 times multiple valuations. And all of a sudden, like, MTV is like, well, we kind of invented this whole thing. We need to spin our web properties off. And so there was this whole MTVI concept. And somewhere I still have my letter of grant of shares as to how many shares I was going to get when this entity was created. And I remember the joke on the floor at the time was, we were running around yelling, like, we're going to be thousandaires. This was around the time that MTV was in talks with SonicNet and ended up acquiring SonicNet. And I remember there was this kind of secret code name that was being used, Super Music Network. And just to show how sometimes a big company working in one direction, but not necessarily thinking about all the little things, there was a production assistant at MTV.com who, you would just hear things being talked about. Like this was like open concept floor. Someone walking down the hall would just be talking about something and everybody would overhear it. So, this concept of the Super Music Network came up. So this kid went out and registered supermusicnetwork.com. And nobody at MTV thought like, oh, we should register that domain. So I remember him telling me that he was holding out for them to buy it from him. And then I guess one day he got called into legal and business affairs and told that his blue book required anything that he did as an employee of MTV was owned by MTV. So I don't think he got the payout that he was looking for. But anyway, with that came a move, and all of the .com stuff got moved down from the main MTV building at 1515 Broadway, and we got moved down to 770 Broadway into what were at the times beautiful, well-appointed offices. We had a music lounge down there with us with an audio system to rival any audio system. But I remember before we were leaving saying, and I was still young and probably a little bit unaware of saying things off the cuff, and what in my position should I be saying out loud to people who worked below me. But I remember saying, we'll be back at 1515 within 6 months time. This experiment won't last. It was great to have our own space and to kind of be seen as our own thing, but it was a complete disconnect from the channel. And so much of what we were doing was tied into channel programming. And at the time, let's remember MTV was printing money, right? MTV was the highest rated events, and ad sales was just driving so much that as much as we thought we were creating all this great original content, we were still responsible for 90% of what we were doing was tied directly to what channel programming was demanding. So in the end, we did end up moving back to 1515 Broadway. And at that time was when we started to see some other shifts, Andrew. So at this time, Sarah Cohen was running MTV.com. Tom Calderone and Amy Doyle were running music programming. And there was a push for .com to become more integrated into understanding what was going on at the channel. MTV.com was asking the channel to allow for the leads of different departments within MTV.com, the music department, the people who are working on Real World and Road Rules. Like, how are we being integrated in with the producers or the departments overseeing that for the channel? And so the request was made that I be allowed to join the music department weekly meeting when all the video submissions were coming in and all the programming discussion. I was invited in, and it was met with real skepticism at the time. There were a number of people within the music and talent department on the 25th floor who I don't think really liked somebody from the outside being brought in. It was a very close-knit group. There was a lot of pride and ownership around what was done in that department. And it was really kind of a prove yourself moment. I think one of the things that I always joked around about was my tenure at MTV was predicated on nobody knowing exactly what I did, but knowing they couldn't do it without me.
Right.
Right, because
Right.
MTV was always going through some sort of reorganization, and anybody at a middle level was on the chopping block, right? And I now had been at MTV, like people generally were there for 2 years or they were there for 15 years. And anything in between was this vast oasis of uncertainty. Because a lot of people just use it as a jumping off point to get a career someplace else. But the people who were in it for the long haul had been there and they had kind of developed real relationships, and your Judy McGrath, your David Cohn, your people who had grown up at the channel.
A lot of the music and talent team had probably been there a long time, created the strategies and the way that the meetings were run, and they had the final say and all that kind
Yeah,
of
and
stuff.
I think there was some degree of that, but I think also once I was in, and then I then made a pitch for Perry to be brought in, and then for Courtney Smith to be brought in, right? Because it wasn't just me. I wasn't the only one doing this. And we were realizing that our team needed to be part of the discussion, because hearing that information, seeing the videos, hearing the pitch from the label, knowing all of the information was such a huge part of the decision making we were doing that I couldn't be responsible for bringing everything back and disseminating it to this whole team of people. Plus Perry represented a side of, different genres and different relationships with publicists and with label folks from what I had. I was really by this time, as the director of the department, overseeing our whole team of producers and PAs and designers, and we were building all the things on the content side, and then also maintaining the relationships with the label departments. And that was, at this point now, we had video promotions people, plus we had the digital people at the labels that we were dealing with. So there was just way too much for me to be
Of
in the
course.
weeds on,
Yeah.
and I needed Perry and Courtney to really be, uh, you know, delivering on all of that day to day of the programming. We were doing MTV.com radio at this point, where we were programming radio stations, and there was all kinds of stuff that really fell within our purview.
It also was important that we were hearing what was happening internally rather than hearing from a label rep at a label what MTV was doing on air, and could we do the same thing online? Like, so it was, we needed to close that gap, close that loop on the synergy of what we're all working on, so that there wasn't a missed opportunity, so that we weren't necessarily finding out too late that something was happening and we needed an artist to do something on the .com side to sort of make it all work.
Yeah, the synergy, and that's the word that was the word that permeated throughout so many of those discussions, and kind of bounced around the walls at MTV. I think the other thing that the music team, programming team, started to realize was, we were an asset to what they were doing, because they didn't always have room to do things, or they wanted to kind of start slowly on something and see how it would continue to develop. And not that we were a dumping ground, but we again we didn't have the constraints. Like, we were able to take on, can we do these things that mirror what the channel is doing? Yes. Can we also do things outside of what the channel is doing? Absolutely. So if we needed to present an opportunity for a label, for an artist, where it was like, we really need to show and we really need to deliver on this, it's like, well, we can do these things, and this is going to drive, you know ultimately, towards more things happening. And it became a bigger part of a package, right? So it was
Right.
like, here's what we can do at MTV, here's what we can do at MTV2, here's what we can do at the different genre channels. Here's what we can do at MTV.com. Right now, it's a much bigger, solidified proposition, as opposed to this fractured. We're going to do a little bit here. We're going to do a little bit there.
You mentioned Courtney Smith. And in addition to Courtney, Holly Showman, who was, like overseeing MTV2, and you were seen in the department as someone who had your finger on the pulse with emerging music and that whole scene in the UK and New York. Probably before MTV came on board, you were like an ambassador of great new indie music. So how did you discover a lot of these artists, and how did you get to discover them and hear the music? Because streaming wasn't really around. Radio maybe played mostly popular music.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I hope that I was seen that way. Maybe all these years later, it's kind of come to bear. But yeah, I mean, that was where my heart was. Right, I had come out of the kind of indie music world, running a little indie record store in Philadelphia and playing in indie bands, and getting to open for bands that would go on to huge success. Andrew, I know from listening to the podcast previously, you're a big Oasis fan, but I got my band open for the first Oasis show in Philadelphia.
Wow.
And so then getting to interact with them at MTV and whatnot was always fun to see that rise and that trajectory. But at the time, I was very closely aligned, both professionally and through friendship with Holly Showman, Matt Pinfield. I mean, I was just a voracious music fan, right? That's how I started my career, right? Like I was a fan, and as a musician and as somebody who loved kind of being around music, growing up with music. My parents were both musicians, coming from a musical family. I just always wanted to be around music, and to get to do it professionally, I knew that I had to still appreciate it as a fan, otherwise it just became a job. So a lot of the stuff that I worked on at MTV wasn't necessarily what I personally was a fan of, but I was okay with that because on the one hand, MTV.com allowed for me to do projects with the things I was passionate about, and the rest of it was my job. But how I was discovering stuff, I mean, I was buying records. I had friends who worked at a variety of record stores in and around the village. When I first came to New York, I was augmenting my income by buying records at places in the West Village where things were not cool, and then I would go over to the East Village and sell them where it was cool, and I would make arbitrage on the difference, and that would pay for my dinner that week.
Well, I mean, basically, you going to record stores is like now kids scroll through playlists on
Yeah,
Spotify.
yeah.
So
I mean,
you were basically the same
I
methodology.
was I was reading a lot of the press, because I had worked at a mom and pop record store. I had become keenly aware of the weekly British press with the Melody Maker and the NME, so that was tipping me to a lot of the stuff that was coming from the UK. Um, I was going out to club nights around New York where different types of music were being played. So I was hearing new bands. I was seeing like showcase like little things where bands were coming and playing. And I still had friends who were musicians. So, I was still just kind of plugged in that way. In fact, the early part of that MTV local job that I had, because the job required us to be dealing with all these little independent scenes and all the top 75 markets. When you get past the top 20 markets, like you start to get into some smaller towns. I
Right.
mean, I was hearing about bands that our label partners were going on to sign. I ended up getting asked to do A&R scouting for Epic Records because of stuff that all the label people had M2 on in their offices 24 hours a day. So at however many times during the day, the content we were programming was popping up on their screens, and I was writing things. I was writing record reviews, I was writing show reviews, I was writing all kinds of stuff, so my name was popping up. And so ultimately they were like, who is this guy, like we should hire him. So I got MTV's blessing to be a freelance A&R scout for Epic for a while. Those things just all were part of my identity, I guess, at what I was doing for MTV.
Right.
um,
Makes sense.
Was there one band that you heard of or knew about very early that went on to have big MTV or MTV2 support and kind of became a really big commercial success? Also, do you recall any of the performances or interviews that we did at 770 Broadway?
I remember being in a meeting with Holly Showman from MTV2. She had just come back from London, and she was so excited to tell me about a band that she discovered while she was there. And she starts telling me about Coldplay, and I was like, "Oh, right, like I have their first couple singles." And so that obviously was one. Um, but that was kind of happening on its own. I don't know that I can say that I was, really kind of championing that at MTV. The one that I do remember championing, and I don't know that I would say that they got, a huge amount of, um, well, I mean, it was maybe after I'd left, but Snow Patrol was a band that I remember talking about in some like MTVU discussions,
Wow.
wanting to incorporate. And then this was before, obviously, before Chasing Cars came out, and so I remember them being included on some sort of MTVU playlist or compilation or something, and then the channel, and then MTV2 starting to get behind it and whatnot. I remember Coldplay performed at 770,
Yeah.
and I also had vivid memories of in the post Bittersweet Symphony time, Richard Ashcroft came in and did a
Right.
solo acoustic performance,
Wow.
probably for his first solo record. Um,
Who is opening up for Oasis in
yeah, yeah,
the UK? I've never seen the Verve, but
good callback.
lifelong fan.
Um, yeah, that was exciting for me personally. I remember some of the other, not at 770, but some of the other 1515 things that we did. Um, one of my favorite kind of fun stories was in the music lounge on the 25th floor. Alanis Morisette came in to perform, and I guess this must have been kind of the launch of her second album, and uh, the the lounge, the 25th floor lounge, as you both know, was a completely separate key card. You had to
Yeah.
have like special access to get in. Um, our offices for MTV.com are on the 29th floor. I was constantly running between the two floors. And I remember for that particular performance, I showed up a few minutes late and I swiped my card and I opened the door to a packed room full of people, like all the senior VPs from MTV News, MTV Programming. Judy McGrath was there. And they're the label people, label presidents, and Alanis at the front of the room. And so I just kind of like sneak in and I'm standing in the back corner. Now just under 6'4". I'm in the back corner. I've just kind of, brought attention to myself. Alanis starts singing the song, and I don't recall the song, but it is clearly kind of like an angry, jilted by a lover sort of song. And she is singing this song looking dead into my eyes. And it's at the point now, because the way that the lounge was set up was there were two sofas on the sidewall and then a sofa where people would have had their backs seated facing her with their backs to me. And so
Yeah.
I'm standing 3 feet behind them against the wall in the corner. And it's now at the point where the people that are sitting there are turning over, looking over their shoulder to see who is she singing this to. And I'm just standing there, like trying to be as cool and calm as possible. And I remember afterwards going up to her and she grabs my wrist and she's like, I just had to pick a point in the room and sing that song. She's like, you were the tallest thing, like you were the high point in the room. And everybody, I remember people giving me a hard time about that for a while.
I love that. That's amazing.
We're gonna do a quick Q&A with you that wasn't on the questions that we sent. So Andrew's gonna give you some questions and just
Yeah, quick fire.
see if you can
quick
answer,
fire.
answer
All right.
these.
Yeah. 30 seconds roughly on the clock, but let's just get through these. And, first thing that comes to mind. Favorite era, 70s or the 80s?
80s.
Okay. In that 80s era, would you rather have grown up in London or New York?
London.
Thank you. The Osbournes or Deaf to Us Part, Carmen and Dave?
The Osbournes. I don't even know that I know what the second one was.
Oh, Dave Navarro.
and Carmen Electra,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I love Dave, but I'm going to stick with Osbournes.
All right, cool. What's your most proud piece of music memorabilia?
That's a tough one. Probably my Interpol Turn on the Bright Lights gold record.
Amazing. Favorite, Beavis or Butthead or Celebrity Deathmatch?
Beavis and Butthead.
You may or not have seen this. So in the Ozzy Osbourne fight in an episode of Celebrity Deathmatch, who did he fight? Elton John or the Queen?
Queen.
It was actually both.
Oh.
The Queen came to
Queen,
save...
I meant Elton John.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. This is probably a no-brainer. Favorite album, Kid A or Interpol's Turn on the Bright Lights?
Oh, that's a tough one for different reasons, obviously.
Right. Really? Okay. Oasis or Blur?
Blur.
Okay. Favorite MTV VJ, Carson or Damien?
In the time, Carson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting answers.
Good.
Yeah, it's a little tricky pulling things that you've worked with and pitting them against things that you're just a fan of from
Right.
a distance.
Talking about Interpol, young New York City based band, you were already working at MTV during that time. You helped them score a label deal, you were managing them, and a lot of support on MTV too. So, what was it like having a day job at MTV and then managing an up and coming band at night? And then what was your decision to leave MTV?
Yeah, there's a lot packed in there. So Perry, you had the opportunity to tell me something earlier that you don't think you'd ever shared with me. I'm gonna flip the script here. So my introduction to Interpol came through Napster, of all things. Right, I had read the name probably in Time Out magazine in a show preview, and so I went on, and I still have in my collection a notebook that I kept where I would keep track of bands that I'd read about, and I had this whole system where if I listened to it, I would put a check mark. If I bought it, I would cross it out. And it was my way of keeping straight like all the music that I was discovering, listening to, buying, right? Because I'm the type of person who goes into a record store and I end up buying the records that I already own because I don't recall them having them. So I had read about Interpol, listened to them on Napster, and then I made plans to go see them. And the first opportunity for that when they were playing in New York coincided with my birthday. And so I remember Perry and our friend Rachel McLean from MTV.com asking me at lunch, "What are you doing for your birthday?" And I said, "Oh, I'm going to Mercury Lounge to see this band that I have been wanting to see." And they were like, "No, we're taking you out for your birthday. We're going to go out." And we pulled a bunch of people together. And so I ended up not going to see Interpol that
Oh
night.
no.
So my first time going to see Interpol was actually uh, a month later, but in the end, it all still kind of worked out. So life at that time was I was a young single guy living in New York City with a great job, uh, you know, upward trajectory at work. Um, I was out practically every night at a label dinner or a showcase or something for that. And then this band crosses my radar, and I think the one thing kind of in hindsight looking back that I've kind of realized is that at the time at MTV, things kind of flew across our desks and projects kind of came and went so fast that I felt like we were barely making a mark, right? It was like, here's what we're doing for this. Boom, here's what we're doing for this. And like things just kind of shuffled in and out so fast. And as you all know, being at MTV, we were seen in a light because of the power that the channel had. We were seen as having this impact that I don't feel that I personally felt I was contributing as much as I was being credited with. So I was getting all these gold and platinum records being sent to my office for all of my support. And I was like, I don't really feel that I did anything. And my statement at the time, and Perry, you may remember this, I didn't hang any of those in my office. And the reason was I didn't felt that I deserved them. So
Although you did put out your Creed one.
Creed.
with the flashing blinking light at the top.
Yes.
Well,
What was that, 20 million
someplace.
albums?
It just had to sit someplace. So
Yeah.
it sat on top of my filing cabinet. But I think I gave that to Elaine Mackles. So anyway, so back to the original point. Here I discovered this band that I really liked, and when I saw them, I thought these guys have something going on. I think that I can contribute. And so I I didn't say anything the night that I first saw them. I saw them at Brownies. I went up and I bought their self-released EP from them, but I didn't talk to them. I didn't say anything. And I went home and I kicked myself for not doing something then and there. And I was like, "Oh my god, somebody else is going to sign them as their manager. I lost my shot. Like I missed out." And then I saw their email address on the back of their EP and I was like, "I'm going to send them an email. I can't send them an email from my MTV address because they're going to think I'm an idiot." So I like made up a whole new email address to like email them from, and you know, met up with them, chatted with them. And here I thought like, "Oh, I've been working at MTV for all this time. Like I know a thing or two about the music business." Um, I'd had the luxury of sitting in the music lounge when Paul McGuinness came in to talk about the new U2 record, or when um, Cliff and Peter would come in to talk about Metallica, and the Radiohead team would come in to present like, here's the plan for this. So like all the time I'd been kind of gleaning all this information and whatnot, but I didn't know anything about what I was doing. All I knew was that I could connect this band with people that would like what they were doing, that I knew how to do that. So I would work all day at MTV. I mean, all day being 10 to 6 or whatever our time was. Then I would probably stay a little bit later just to use MTV resources to do a little bit of work. Then I would go home. I would do some calls out to LA. I would do some stuff at home. I would eat dinner and then I would go out. And in New York, like back then at that age, like if you went out before 11 o'clock, that was kind of lame. So I was out from like midnight to 3 or 4 when the bars closed, and then I would come home and start all over the next day. Now, there were certainly times, and Perry will definitely remember this, where I came straight into work from wherever I'd been the night before, running meetings, sometimes not in the best shape, but it was the passion was fueling, the energy and the resources, right? It was exciting, right? It was an exciting time. There was a lot going on. And I finally felt like I was actually making a mark on something. Now, at the time at MTV, you know, it was, I was telling people what I was doing, but it was kind of viewed as like, "Oh, Brandon's got a thing," right? Like just the same way
Right.
as it was like, "Oh, I'm DJing at this club, you should come," or like, "Oh, like I have a piece of art in this exhibit, like you should come." Nobody was taking it seriously. Then all of a sudden, the people outside the building that all of the music and talent people talk to were talking about the band. And then all of a sudden it was being talked about in the music lounge. And I remember having to recuse myself from meetings so that everybody else could talk about the band. So the decision to leave was not one that I took lightly, because obviously I was in a director role on track to a VP role, or at least I would like to think so. I had been at MTV for 7 years. I think a lot of people saw me as the person that if they couldn't figure something out, I was the person who would know the answer, or at least know who to put them in touch with. I was leaving behind a salary, benefits, and I went to Tom Calderon, who also mentored me a great deal, whether he knew it or not. And I went to him for advice. And I said, "Tom, look, I have this opportunity to do this. And I know I'd be turning away on something that's great and this family of people that I've been working with." And he said, "Brandon, you could leave, you could do this, you could fail spectacularly, and nobody here would know the difference. And you could come back in 6 months and we would welcome you back." He said, "But that's not what's going to happen." Right? He said, this is your opportunity to, you know, to do your thing and to kind of write your path. Um, and right, it was kind of that blessing and that understanding that like just the fact that I had the courage to come to him and was considering this was something so kind of outside of what like normally went on that uh that it felt like I was making the right decision. Now little did I know that like shortly after I left hot on my heels would come in people who went on to manage, Justin Bieber
Exactly.
um,
Exactly.
so mine was just a little ripple in the pond. But strangely, before I left the second band that I signed to my management company, I discovered through MTV, which was Elephant, when the folks from Palm Pictures came in and presented a video in the music meeting. And I was like, well, I can't leave and start a management company with one client. That would be seemingly irresponsible of me. Little did I know at the time that Interpol would take off in the way that it did. But the crazy thing, and Perry, I'm curious as to your take on this. The crazy thing is, after I left, I kind of never looked back. And it wasn't intentional that I didn't come to the folks at MTV for help. It was that I didn't want it to be seen that I was being given opportunities or that people were doing things for the band because that it was for me. Like I wanted it to stand on its own 2 feet. And so, like, I never came in to any of the meetings. I never came in to present anything. I let the label people do that on their own.
So they were
Um,
on Matador, right?
Matador, yeah.
Yeah,
And so
yeah.
they were dealing with Tuma, um, and maybe Yomi before Tuma. I can't recall the sequence of who kind of was doing the indie labels at the time.
Who was Nils? Was it at
Yeah,
Matador?
just
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. The very first time I remember seeing the band was also at Mercury Lounge, and I was like, "Wow!" I mean, it was completely different than anything I had heard before, and not stuff that I would normally have thought I would enjoy, but I was totally into it. And then it was like Mercury Lounge, Bowery, I think it was Hammerstein, maybe, then Radio City. And it's like it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I mean, I'm like, if there's an audience for this, we should be supporting it. It really, I mean, obviously, yes, there was a connection to you, and I wanted to make sure that, you know, I was supporting you, but I wasn't supporting you in a way that wasn't earned, if that makes sense. Because I think the band earned it. I mean,
Yeah.
they were just really great.
If they had been a terrible band, then it would have been a little bit different.
Right. Exactly.
uh,
Exactly. Yeah. So no, I mean, we loved doing anything and everything we could to support them, and I think we did a good job with that.
yeah, I mean, I still remember fondly you know, when PDA was nominated for the MTV2 award, which was, we didn't win, but just to be, and that was a video that I was really proud of. The first video, I mean, having come from MTV, the first video that I was involved with, the kind of on the production side, and really the credit does go to Nils Bernstein, who not only was the publicist at Matador, but also did all the video stuff and did the video production stuff. But bringing in Christopher Mills, who to that point had done, some videos for some smaller Canadian artists, but that was really his first big video. And, you know, the concept and whatnot was fascinating, and it looked unlike anything else at the
Right.
time.
Right.
So it
Yeah.
really kind of fit aesthetically with everything else that was going on. And then I went on to work with Christopher Mills actually for a video that I did with Elephant later. And then he and the nice thing with the Interpol stuff was while I was working with them at MTV, a lot of the people that I was working with I was bringing into the fold to help, and people that I had grown to trust for their judgment and their skill and whatever they did at MTV. So Sean McCabe, who was one of the designers from TV.com, he did all of the early design work
Oh
for the
wow.
Interpol records. Um, Ray Dolber, who was one of our production folks at
Yep.
MTV.com, he ran the Interpol website and fan club for several years.
Wow.
Right, like these were people that I was friends with around the office, but who also were fans of the band and that I trusted and knew how to do things that I didn't necessarily know how to do. I remember being told, here's your budget for what we can do with the first Interpol EP, like go crazy. And I went and I met with MTV.com's design director 3 and Sean McCabe and was
Yeah.
like,
Yep.
here's my ideas. Like, what do you guys think? Like if I just told you you have free reign, and that's how we kind of came up with the concept for that first EP.
I'd love to do another episode with you talking about that era of music because obviously it was such a big deal and Interpol was so integral in it. But I want to jump forward to sort of now. Do you still have the record store? Are we still doing that?
Yeah, so because I don't have enough things going on apart from my day job and my family and whatnot. Yeah, about 8 months ago, I opened a record store in Maplewood, New Jersey, called Soma Sounds Records, at Soma Sounds Records on Instagram. Follow us. And it's this is again like reconnecting to why I do this in the first place, right? Like I got my start in high school working at record stores as part-time jobs, and then coming out of college after I'd promoted shows all through college and been at the college radio station and moving back home thinking I'm going to move to LA and get a job in the music business and getting a job at the record store and then meeting some guys and joining a band and right like it's that interaction with fans, it's the kind of fetishization of the object and the physical thing. And that's what really drew me in the first place, the artwork, the sleeve, the liner notes. I mean, I distinctly remember meetings at MTV where somebody would come in. Scott Roger, who was managing Bjork, came in, and we're in the music lounge, and I'm standing there with him and Amy Doyle. And I asked Scott, "How did you first meet Bjork?" And he said, "Oh, well, my band was touring in Iceland and the Sugar Cubes opened up for us. And Bjork
Wow.
was 15 years old." And I said, "Oh, what was the band?" And he's like, "Oh, you probably wouldn't know." And Amy goes, I'm sure he would. It was Dead Can Dance. Like that was insane to me that he was part of that era of Dead Can Dance, like when there was actually like rock instrumentation. And so and then now he's managing Paul McCartney, and it is like all this
Wow.
kind of amazing connections and people weaving their way through your life. But yeah, the record store is just kind of a passion play. It's an extension of my side hustle of what I've been doing my entire career, which is just buying selling records so that I could buy more records, trying to have a no real negative impact on like my spending habits.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to do an episode taking us through some of those collections and your
Oh, yeah.
process.
There's a million stories that we could get into, and
Yeah,
this is bringing a lot of it back. So I really
yeah,
appreciate you guys having me on today to kind of
cool.
relive some of it.
Yeah, it was definitely cool. We've talked a lot about some venues in New York. We like to throw this question out. A favorite current or past New York City venue, or if you have one in Philly, it could be from a favorite show you've seen there or just a great venue.
I think my favorite New York venue, for a lot of reasons, is Bowery Ballroom, which I'm sure is an answer that you hear when you ask this question. But it is just small enough to feel intimate, and just big enough to feel like you're surrounded by
Greatness.
a great crowd of people. It's got great sound, great sight lines, a great bar, the whole thing. I love just the vibe, the physical location itself, having been an old shoe store. Like there's just so much history in the room.
Mhm.
And then there's the musical history of like, the bands that I've seen there, my personal experiences with John Moore, the booker there, being like the first person to really embrace Interpol. I remember when I was working with Interpol, we were the first band to do 3 consecutive nights at the Bowery Ballroom, and that was
Oh,
seen as an insane proposition at the time, but something that a challenge that we took on. So yeah, I love the venue. I mean, I've seen great shows at Mercury. I remember when Echo and the Bunnymen came back for Evergreen, and they did a series of shows at the Mercury Lounge, which is insane to think of seeing Echo and the Bunnymen like
right.
after Killing Moon and all that stuff at the Mercury Lounge. Seeing back in that early 2000s era, seeing the Walkmen at Brownies. Muse played their first New York show at Brownies. I remember seeing Bjork play at Riverside Church, which was just a spectacular environment. She was like 3 feet away from the audience. Sigaros at the Beacon.
List
A
goes
special
on.
invite show for The Cure at Roseland for Bloodflowers.
Hmm.
And one of the things that was great about shows in New York and working at MTV at that time was being in a position of working in the music and talent department and having relationships with the labels, was being invited to things and being given tickets to things. What was great was being able to share that with the people that we worked with at MTV. And I loved being able to bring people from MTV.com.
Right.
I remember taking Seth Schulte, who was a huge Oasis fan, to Radio City, or Ray Dolber, who was a huge Jesus and Mary chain, to see them at the Fez, or, things like that, where it was, getting to share in that I'm in this role, but it's not just me, right? Like,
Yeah.
we're a team. So
Right. Yeah.
Very, very positive. Love it. And you're such a humble person, and you kind of get that from the story of the plaques not being hung up because you feel like you don't deserve them, and not taking advantage of favors for Interpol. So shows what kind of guy you are. And I've learned a lot. I kind of, as I mentioned in the beginning, someone I've known the name, but it's really interesting hearing your background.
yeah, well, now Perry can tell you all the stories of me being a terrible boss.
No, there are none. But we do want to thank you for taking the time. We really, really appreciate it. This was awesome to kind of catch up. There's a lot of things that you talked about that I had forgotten about.
It's fun getting to remember and relive, and just be forced to kind of think about some of those things, and the questions you sent ahead of time and the questions today, like, and some of the things that came up as we talked. It was an incredible time, and it's kind of amazing to see some of the things that we accomplished and did, and sometimes in the in the face of not a ton of support for what we were trying to do, but it's been really fun. And like I said, I've got a million more stories, so
All right.
let's keep this going. And
We have a part 2 coming.
yeah, for sure. And best of continued luck with you guys with the podcast. And
Thank you.
if there's anybody I can help reconnect you with, I'd love to. I've been enjoying listening to all the ones that you've done, and some of the names of people that have drifted apart, but remembering time spent working with them and the things that kind of came after me and my time at MTV.
All right. Well, thank you, Brandon.
Right.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks
All
for the
right.
chat.
Thank
Talk
you.
soon.
We'll talk to you later.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Bye. Thank you for joining us today in the Music Lounge.
And tune in next week to hear more stories about your favorite era of MTV.